She fired the shot at 23 minutes past midnight. Black wedding dress, 11 cents in her pocket, a rifle still warm in her hands. She had arrived in Red Rock 3 weeks earlier looking for a husband. What she found instead was a town built on stolen silver and buried men, and a choice that only someone with nothing left to lose could make clearly. This is how she made it. She fired the shot at 23 minutes past midnight. The sound cracked off the canyon walls and rolled out across the Colorado darkness like something ancient waking up. Snow was falling in thin sideways sheets, and the wind off the high peaks cut straight through to bone. She stood at the edge of the ravine with the rifle still warm in her hands, her black dress torn at the shoulder, her hair loose and wild around her face, and she did not shake, not even a little. 30 yards below, in the shadows between the rocks, a man in a blue work shirt and a brown leather vest looked up at the ridgeline. He had been running. He stopped running. And in the half second that every man with guns turned to find the shooter, he moved. She watched him clear the rocks and drop into the ravine, and she let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like her entire life. Later, much later, when people in Red Rock asked her how a woman who arrived in their town with 11 cents in a black wedding dress ended up standing on a canyon ridge with a rifle at midnight, she never knew quite where to start. So we will start at the beginning. The stagecoach came into Red Rock on the 15th of October, 1878, 3 hours behind schedule because of mud on the lower switchbacks in a wheel that had needed patching just outside of Durango. The town sat in a shallow bowl between two ridgelines in the San Juan Mountains, and when the light was right, which it rarely was in October, you could look up in any direction and see peaks that touched the clouds. Most days the mountains just looked cold. Most days they looked like walls. The main street was 6 blocks of packed dirt that turned to ankle-deep mud when it rained and froze solid when it didn't. There was a Wells Fargo office, a general store with a porch that leaned slightly to the left, a barber shop, 2 saloons, a church at the far end of the street that looked considerably smaller than both saloons, and a scattering of other businesses that had taken hold in the years since the silver strike and had not yet let go. The population was somewhere between 400 and 500, depending on how many miners had come down from the high camps that season. Most of them were men. Most of them were tired. The people on the main street that afternoon had not gathered to watch the stagecoach arrive. They had gathered because word had gotten around that the coach was carrying something unusual. Not silver, not supplies, something stranger. A mail-order bride. They were not an uncommon thing in these mountain towns. Men who worked the mines and the ranches sent letters east, described themselves in the most favorable terms they could manage, and waited. Sometimes a woman answered. Sometimes she came. It was a practical arrangement for practical people, and nobody thought much of it one way or the other. But this one, they had heard, was different. When the stagecoach door opened and Nora Voss stepped down onto the street of Red Rock, Colorado, there was a silence that started at the Wells Fargo office and moved outward in both directions like a stone dropped in still water. She was 28 years old, though she looked older in the way that people who have survived things look older. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that might have been described as pretty under different circumstances, but at that moment simply looked composed. Careful. The kind of face that had learned to give nothing away. She was wearing a wedding dress. It was black. Not dark blue, not charcoal gray, not some trick of shadow or poor fabric dye. It was black. The bodice was fitted the skewer full, the construction clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing with a needle and thread. It was a good dress, a well-made dress, and it was absolutely unmistakably black. The people on the street looked at it and did not know what to do with what they were seeing. Was this a wedding or a funeral? Had she already been widowed somewhere between Missouri and Colorado? Was she in mourning? Was she mad? She was none of those things, or perhaps she was all of them, a little. But she stood on the mud of Red Rock's main street and looked at the people looking at her, and she did not explain herself. She held a small carpet bag in both hands, and inside that bag was everything she owned. A spare dress carefully mended at both elbows, a sewing kit that had belonged to her father, a daguerreotype of a man in a Union Army uniform standing very straight in front of a painted backdrop, and a coin purse with 11 cents, 1 dime, 1 penny, both worn so smooth the faces were nearly gone. She was looking for Eli Whitmore. His name had been on the letter that had found her in St. Louis 6 weeks earlier when she had been sleeping on a church pew, with the permission of the minister, and surviving on whatever work she could find with her needle and thread. The letter had been written in plain, careful script, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write by someone who insisted on it. It had described a small horse ranch outside a mining town in Colorado. It had described a man of 42 who had been alone for 3 years and was not looking for romance, only for a partner. Someone who valued honest work over easy comfort. It had said, "I will meet you at the stagecoach station on the 15th of October." She had answered it the same night she received it by candlelight, sitting on the floor of the church because there was nowhere else to sit. She had not told the man about her husband who was dead. She had not told him about the 4 years before her husband died, the years she had learned to read footsteps and calculate moods and sleep with a chair wedged under the doorknob. Some truths were too heavy for a letter. She had told him what she could offer, which was the same thing her father had given her, precision with a needle, discipline in all weather, and the capacity for hard work without complaint. She had told him she would come. So here she was. The man who stepped forward from the shadows of the Wells Fargo porch was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that comes not from any deliberate effort, but from years of physical work that never stops. His hair was dark with silver at the temples, and he moved with the practiced economy of a man who did not waste motion. He wore a blue work shirt under a brown leather vest, both worn but clean, and his boots were the boots of a man who actually rode horses rather than standing near them for the sake of appearance. His eyes were the color of winter sky, that particular flat gray that carries no warmth in it. He stopped 6 feet away from her. He looked at the carpet bag. He looked at the black dress. He looked at the fading bruise on her left cheekbone that she had tried to cover with powder that morning, but that the motion of the coach had by now mostly uncovered. He said her name, a question and a statement at once. She said yes. She said his name back. And then Eli Whitmore shook his head, slowly, once. The way a man shakes his head when he has no pleasure in what he has to say, but will say it cleanly rather than let it fester. He had not written that letter. She heard the words and felt the ground shift under her feet. Not literally. She was standing solidly on the mud of the main street of Red Rock, and her footing did not change. But something inside her tilted some carefully constructed architecture of hope that she had been building for 6 weeks, and she felt it go. A second voice came from behind and to the left, smooth and genial, the voice of a man who had practiced sounding reasonable for so long that it had become automatic. Chester Holt was 55 years old, silver-bearded, silver-haired, dressed in a coat that had been made in Denver by someone who knew what they were doing. He was not a large man, but he occupied space with the confidence of someone who had not been told no in a very long time. He had the hands of a man who had not done physical labor in 20 years, and the eyes of a man who had never stopped calculating. He stepped out from the porch with his hands open, his expression one of pleasant apology. He explained that Eli was an old friend, that Eli had been alone on that ranch for 3 years since his wife passed and was, as any man could see, too stubborn to do anything about it himself. That he, Chester Holt, had simply taken it upon himself to facilitate an arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. He had signed Eli's name to the letter. He spread his hands wider. He was smiling. He said the word kindness. Eli Whitmore said very quietly that what Chester had done was not kindness, that it was manipulation, that he had made promises in another man's name without that man's knowledge or consent, and that there was no version of that which could be called anything other than what it was. His voice did not rise. It became, if anything, quieter. The kind of quiet that is louder than shouting. By this point, the crowd on the main street had stopped pretending not to watch. Men on the porch of the general store had shifted to get a better view. 2 women coming out of the dry goods store had stopped and were standing very still. A boy of perhaps 10, the sheriff's son by the look of him, with his father's blunt, honest face and his mother's watchful eyes, was sitting on the top rail of a hitching post, with his legs dangling, watching with the focused attention of someone who understood that this was history and intended to remember all of it. Nora Voss stood in the middle of all of it in her black dress and listened to 2 men discuss what to do with her as if she were a parcel that had been sent to the wrong address. She had some practice with that feeling. She had been married to it for 4 years. Chester Holt offered to pay for a room at the boarding house. A temporary solution, he said, until something more suitable could be arranged. He was still smiling. He gestured toward her as if presenting evidence. Eli Whitmore said that Chester was welcome to pay for whatever he liked since this was his doing. He said that what he himself could not do was pretend that a letter he had not written created any obligation he was bound to honor. He said he was sorry for her situation. He said it without looking away. She believed him. That was the strange part. She looked at him, and she believed that he was sorry, and she believed that he meant exactly what he had said, and she believed that there was something else behind those gray eyes, something complicated and closed off, and maybe not entirely unkind, but it did not change anything. He had not written the letter. He would not be marrying her. That part of his life, he said, was finished. He turned and walked away. She stood there for another 3 seconds. She counted them. Then she picked up her carpet bag, which she had set down without noticing, and she turned to Chester Holt and thanked him for the offer of a room, but said she would make her own arrangements. She said it in the voice she had developed over 4 years of marriage, the voice that gave nothing away and asked for nothing. Then she walked down the street away from both of them, away from the crowd and their stares and their pity and their morbid entertainment. She had no idea where she was going. Behind her, she heard Chester Holt's voice low and urbane, saying something to Eli about leaving a woman in that condition. Eli's voice came back flat as a door closing. "You brought her here. You fix it." She kept walking. The street was a study in practical poverty made to look like civilization. Buildings that were mostly raw timber, functional and uninspiring, with signs that announced their purpose in the fewest necessary words. She passed a saloon. She passed a barber shop. She passed a building with a sign for an assay office, where men who had pulled silver from the mountains could have it weighed and valued. She passed 2 men who looked at her black dress and then looked away. October in the mountains. She could feel winter in the air already, a sharpness that had nothing to do with cold wind and everything to do with elevation. The people in the coach had told her that the mountain pass is closed in winter, that once the snow came heavy, Red Rock was effectively sealed off from the outside world until spring. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the pass is closed. Maybe less. 6 weeks and 11 cents. At the far end of the main street where the buildings thinned and gave way to a large open area where freight wagons came and went, she saw a narrow building set slightly back from the road. It was older than most of the others, its timber weathered to gray, with a pipe chimney that was putting out steady white smoke. Sheets and garments were hung on lines in the yard behind it, though the sky had turned the color of old pewter and rain or snow seemed likely before nightfall. A hand-painted sign above the door said Vain Laundry. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 52, perhaps older, with the build of someone who had spent decades at hard physical labor and had not been diminished by it. Her hair was pulled back tight under a work kerchief. Her hands, even from a distance, were the hands of a woman who washed other people's clothes for a living, rough and reddened and strong. She looked at Nora with the particular directness of a person who has learned that the world offers limited time for indirection. She was a black woman in a white man's town in 1878, and she had been running her business alone for 5 years, and she had survived it through a combination of excellence at her trade and an absolute refusal to be invisible, and a talent for reading people that had by now been honed to something close to an instinct. She looked at Nora Voss for perhaps 4 seconds. She looked at the black dress, the carpet bag, the fading bruise. She said, "You need work, not a room." Nora said yes. She said she could sew. Her father had been a military tailor before his death and had taught her everything he knew, which was considerable. She said she worked hard and made no mistakes when she could help it, and when she did make mistakes, she fixed them herself. Harriet Vane stepped out of the doorway and held out a piece of fabric from the basket beside the door. A miner's shirt badly torn along the back seam, done in a way that suggested the seam had given out rather than been cut. She handed Nora the shirt and a needle already threaded and weighted. Nora worked for 4 minutes. Harriet took the shirt back and turned it in her hands and looked at the seam from the inside and the outside and tested it at the stress points with the thumb and forefinger of each hand. She said, "Better than mine. Don't tell anyone." She moved back into the doorway and made a slight motion with her head that meant follow me. The back room was barely large enough for a narrow cot and a wooden crate that served as both table and shelf. The walls were uninsulated timber through which the wind found easy passage, and Nora could see a thin line of gray sky through a gap near the roof. There was a small iron stove in the corner that Harriet lit with the efficiency of a woman who had done it 10,000 times, and within minutes, the room had begun to accumulate something that could generously be called warmth. The offer was simple. 1 week of work in exchange for food and a place to sleep. If the work was satisfactory, they would discuss wages. If it was not, Nora would be given enough to cover a stagecoach ticket somewhere else, and they would part with no hard feelings. Nora said she understood. She set her carpet bag on the cot. She took out her father's sewing kit and arranged it on the wooden crate the way he had taught her, needles on the left thread, organized by weight scissors with the blades closed. She propped the daguerreotype against the wall. Her father stood very straight in his Union uniform, the image already fading but the posture still clear. She did not cry. She had done her crying on the stagecoach, quietly facing the window in the dark stretch of miles between Durango and Red Rock. She had given herself those miles. She was done with them now. Harriet called her to supper at 6 o'clock. Rice and beans and cornbread and the quiet of two women who did not know each other well enough yet to fill the silence with talk. They ate by lamplight in the small room behind the main workroom, and outside the wind had picked up and the first snow of the season was beginning to fall in thin, exploratory flakes, testing the air. After supper, Harriet showed her the operation. The great wooden tubs, the fires beneath them that heated the water, the harsh lye soap that would have Nora's hands raw within the week, the mangle for wringing the heavy wet fabric. She showed her the system for mending, which was organized by priority and by difficulty, and she showed her where the accounts were kept and how they were recorded. Nora watched and remembered. Her father had believed that the difference between competent work and excellent work was attention, that you could teach most people to do a thing adequately, but that excellence required the additional step of caring what happened after you walked away. She had been caring what happened after she walked away since she was 7 years old, standing in her father's tailoring shop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, watching him hold a finished seam up to the light to check it from inside and out. Tomorrow, Harriet said, I will show you the mending pile. We take in the miner's clothes. It is steady work, and it pays better than the washing. I will be ready at dawn, Nora said. Harriet looked at her for a moment. Then she said, that dress. She nodded toward the black wedding dress which Nora had not changed out of because it was the best garment she owned, and there had been no occasion to change. Why black? Nora said it was the cheapest fabric at the store. Black wool does not show stains as readily. It was a practical decision. Harriet looked at her for another moment, and then something shifted in her expression. Something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She said goodnight and left Nora alone in the small room with the soot in the daguerreotype and the sound of snow against the thin walls. It was 2 days before Wade Colton came to the laundry. In those 2 days, Nora learned the rhythms of the work and proved herself sufficient at them, the mending especially. Harriet watched her for the first hour of the first morning and then left her alone with the pile, which was the highest compliment available in that context. She was fast without being careless. She was careless about nothing. She also learned the rhythms of the town, which men paid promptly and which had to be reminded, which women came in themselves and which sent their household help. She learned that Chester Holt owned the largest mine in the canyon and employed roughly a third of the working men in Red Rock and had his fingers in most of the other commerce as well. She learned that Eli Whitmore's ranch was 3 miles north of town, that he had lived there alone for 3 years since his wife passed, and that most people in Red Rock viewed him with the combination of respect and discomfort that attaches itself to a man who has suffered a visible grief and chosen to carry it silently. She learned to recognize Wade Colton before he came through the door by the sound of his boots on the porch boards. He wore the kind of boot that had a slight heel, and the way he walked with a heavy, deliberate step gave him away 6 paces out. He was perhaps 35, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes that moved constantly in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with habit. He wore good clothes for a man who worked for wages, which told you something about who was paying and how much they valued a certain kind of loyalty. He came in with a week's worth of Chester Holt's laundry bundled under one arm and dropped it on the counter with the easy contempt of a man who did not expect to do his own carrying for much longer. He told Harriet it was needed by Friday. He looked at Nora with the slow, appraising look of a man who has decided that every woman in his vicinity is something he should form an opinion about. He asked where she came from. She kept her eyes on her sewing. Missouri, she said. He asked if she had come looking for a husband. She said she had come looking for work. He laughed at that, a sound that contained no actual amusement, and moved toward the counter in a way that contracted the room. Harriet Vane stepped between them with a wooden paddle from the washing tub in both hands, held with the practiced ease of a woman who had decided some time ago where the line was and exactly what she would do when someone crossed it. She told him the laundry would be ready Friday. She told him to come back then. She looked at him with eyes that had been meeting men like Wade Colton all her life and had not yet looked away first. He stepped back. He smiled the way men smile when they are calculating the right moment, not because the moment has passed. He left. Harriet set the paddle down. Her hands, Nora noticed, were not quite steady. She said, "That man is Chester Holt's right hand. He does what Holt tells him to do, and what Holt tells him to do is whatever is necessary. The sheriff," she said, "looks the other way when Colton causes trouble. Has for years." Nora said she understood. She had known men like Colton. She had been married to one. Harriet looked at her. The bruise had almost entirely faded by now, gone from purple to yellow to something barely visible in low light. But Harriet had seen it on the first day and had not forgotten it. She said, "Then you know to be careful." Nora said, "I know." It was Eli Whitmore who came through the door late on the afternoon of the third day. He did not come in with the particular purposefulness of a man who has decided to do something. He came in the way a man comes into a doorway when he is passing and has paused and then entered before he has quite finished deciding whether to. He stopped just inside the door and removed his hat. He looked at Harriet first, then at Nora. He said he had been riding past. He said he had seen Colton's horse at the rail 2 days earlier and had heard about the visit from Pip Connell, who was 10 years old and constitutionally incapable of keeping interesting information to himself. He said he wanted to make sure there had been no trouble. "There had not been trouble," Harriet said. "Not yet." He nodded. He turned to leave and then stopped. He said without turning around that Colton was a man who meant what he said and said less than he meant. That a warning from Colton was not a warning so much as an announcement of intention delivered early as a courtesy. He said she should bolt the door at night. He said it to Nora. She looked at him across the room, this man in his blue shirt and brown leather vest. This man who had looked at her in her black dress in front of the whole town and told her a truth she had not wanted to hear. There was something in his face that she was beginning to understand was not coldness. Coldness is the absence of feeling. This was something else. This was the presence of feeling that had been very deliberately, very methodically sealed off from the outside world. She asked why he was telling her this. She asked why, after everything, he was here at all. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "What happened with the letter was not your fault. And just because I cannot be what you came here looking for does not mean I want to see you harmed." He put his hat back on and went out through the door. That night, when the town was quiet and the fire in the small stove had burned to coals, and the sound of the saloon 3 blocks away had finally faded to nothing, Harriet Vane blew out the lamp in the main workroom, went to the back room where Nora slept and crouched down beside the iron stove. She pried up a stone from the floor. Not with effort, it came up easily, which meant it had been lifted and replaced many times before. Beneath it was a hollow space, and from that space she drew out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She sat on the edge of the cot and unwrapped it on her knees. It was a stack of papers, ledger sheets handwritten in small, careful columns. Numbers and dates and weights running across page after page in handwriting that was not Harriet's. The handwriting of a man who had been precise about things. The handwriting of a man who had believed that precision was its own form of honesty. Her husband, she said, had been good with figures. Better than most. The foreman at the Holt mine had known this and had put Cyrus Vane in charge of secondary records backup ledgers in case the primary books were damaged or lost. Cyrus had done the work for 2 years, and in those 2 years he had noticed things that did not add up. Silver ore came out of the ground at one weight. It arrived at the assay office at a lower weight. Not always and not by dramatic amounts, but consistently across dozens of shipments in a pattern that became unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Harriet handed Nora the papers. Even by lamplight, even without any particular expertise in Manoy accounting, the pattern was visible. Columns that should have matched did not. Totals that had been altered in a way that was almost too careful, almost too precise. The cumulative discrepancy Harriet said her husband had calculated at somewhere above $40,000 worth of silver over 3 years, maybe more, taken a little at a time, spread across enough shipments that no single transaction would draw attention. Cyrus had brought the papers to Harriet on a Friday night in the autumn of 1873. He had told her he was going to take them to the office of the territorial governor in Denver. He had said that Chester Holt was a powerful man, but that some things were too large to be ignored if you put them in front of the right people. On the following Monday morning, there had been what the official report called an accident. A section of tunnel shoring had given way. 4 men had been working in that section. Cyrus Vane was one of them. The body they brought out had to be identified by the ring on his left hand because there was not much else left to identify. The official investigation had taken 3 days and concluded that the shoring timbers had been insufficiently braced, likely due to haste during a recent expansion. The foreman responsible had already left the territory by the time the investigation concluded. Chester Holt had attended the memorial service and spoken about the tragedy of mining work and the importance of safety. He had used the word tragedy 4 times in his remarks, which Harriet had counted from the 4th pew. She had hidden the papers that same evening. Men had come to the house 2 days later, saying they were collecting Cyrus's personal effects from the mine. She had let them search. They had not found what they were looking for. She had kept the papers for 5 years. She had been too afraid to use them and too afraid to destroy them. Nora sat on the edge of the cot and held the ledger sheets in her hands. The lamplight made the columns of numbers glow faintly yellow. Outside, the wind had come up again and was finding all the gaps in the wall. She said these numbers. How certain was he? Harriet said completely. Nora said then, need more than old numbers. We need something happening now, something that cannot be argued away. Harriet watched her. Nora said the stagecoach robberies. She said it carefully as if she were stepping onto ice and testing the weight of each word before she committed to it. There had been 5 of them in the past 2 months, all on the route between Red Rock and Durango, all of them targeting coaches that were carrying refined silver rather than ore. She had heard about them from the other passengers on her own coach, had heard the tight, worried way people talked about them, the way people talk about something that is happening too regularly to be coincidence, but that nobody has quite found the words to name correctly yet. She said someone knows which coaches are worth hitting. Someone knows the schedule from the inside. Harriet was very still. Nora said if Chester Holt is stealing silver from the Mahon, he needs to move it somewhere. He needs to get it out of Red Rock without it appearing in any official record. Staged robberies would do that. Take the silver out quietly, report it stolen publicly, collect the insurance, and keep the physical metal both. She set the papers down on the cot between them. She said, we cannot go to the sheriff. The sheriff, you have already told me that, but there must be someone who cannot be bought. A federal marshal, the state governor, someone. Harriet said, to get to anyone like that, we need proof that is happening now. Not 5 years ago. Nora said yes. Harriet said the old mining camp at Canyon Ridge. Abandoned 5 years ago when the upper claims played out. The buildings are still there. Remote, off the main roads. Nobody goes there in winter. Nora thought about this. Outside, the snow came against the walls and the fire in the stove clicked and settled, and the town of Red Rock made the quiet sounds a town makes when it is trying to sleep. She thought about a man in a blue work shirt and brown leather vest who had looked at her with gray eyes and told her an unwelcome truth and then come back 3 days later to make sure she was safe. She thought about what Harriet had said about Eli Whitmore, that he had been alone for 3 years since his wife died, that most people gave him room because grief of that particular depth tends to make people uncomfortable, that he was known as a man of absolute honesty in a town where honesty had been for sale for some time. She thought about whether honesty and honor were the same thing, and whether a man who had sealed himself off from the world still had enough of both to be trusted when it mattered. She was not certain. She was certain of 11 cents in a black dress and 6 weeks before the mountain passes closed, and a stack of papers that had cost a good man his life and had sat under a stone floor for 5 years, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to use them. Nora Voss put the ledger sheets back in the oilcloth and watched Harriet wrap them carefully. She had been desperate enough for most of her adult life. She was starting to think she might finally be brave enough too. The posse came back on a Thursday. Nora heard them before she saw them. She was in the yard behind the laundry hanging a line of miner's trousers in the thin October sun when the sound of hooves on the main street change quality became something more deliberate and public, the sound of men riding to be seen. She set down the basket and came around to the front of the building and stood at the edge of the porch. Sheriff Drum Connell rode at the front of the column on a gray horse that was too good for the man sitting on it. He was 48, heavy-set, with a face that had spent so many years arranging itself into expressions of authority that the underlying man had become difficult to locate. His badge caught the light. He held himself the way men hold themselves when they are performing something rather than doing it. Behind him rode 7 other men, and behind them, wrists tied and faces arranged into the particular blankness of men who have run out of options, came 3 prisoners. The crowd gathered the way crowds always gather in small towns from all directions at once, as if they had all been waiting in their separate buildings for exactly this sound. Someone cheered, others joined. Connell raised one hand in acknowledgement without quite smiling, the gesture of a man accepting tribute he considers his due. Nora looked at the 3 prisoners. They were rough men, unshaved, trail-worn, dressed in the kind of clothes that had been worn too long in too many kinds of weather. They looked at a distance like the sort of men who rob stagecoaches. Hard-faced, dangerous, remorseless. But she had spent 4 years reading men who did not want to be read, and something about these 3 was not right. They sat their horse without the coiled tension of captured men calculating odds. They were not looking at the crowd. They were not looking at the road. They were not looking at anything in particular, which was itself a thing worth noticing. Men who have truly been caught spend their first hours in captivity in a state of furious internal arithmetic, running and rerunning the numbers of how they got here and how they might get out. These 3 looked like men who were somewhere they had expected to be. She was still thinking about this when Harriet appeared beside her, wiping her hands on her work apron, watching the procession with her arms folded and her expression arranged into something neutral that covered something else entirely. Harriet said 5 robberies and now 3 men caught in a line shack 20 miles north with their hands in their laps. She said it quietly, not to anyone in particular. Nora said the sheriff found them too easily. Harriet said nothing, but she turned and went back inside, and Nora noticed she did not look relieved. It was Eli Whitmore who came to the laundry that evening an hour before sunset. He did not knock the way a man knocks when he has business. He knocked the way a man knocks when he has something he is not sure how to begin. Harriet let him in and went to the back, and he stood in the main workroom with his hat in his hands and his blue shirt rolled to the elbows and looked at Nora across the mending table. He said he had ridden with the posse. She waited. He said that the 3 men they found had been in a line shack that was not difficult to locate once you knew where to look, which they had known before they left Red Rock because someone had received word. He said that when they arrived, the men were inside around a fire with their saddlebags hanging on nails and their weapons stacked in the corner away from their hands. No lookout, no ground covered in the snow around the shack that would indicate anyone had moved in or out recently with any urgency. He said that when Connell questioned them, they confessed before the second question. He set his hat on the corner of the mending table. He said men who shoot a stagecoach driver and take a Wells Fargo strongbox do not confess before the second question. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing its October work against the eaves, probing for weaknesses. Nora said the last 5 robberies were all of them on coaches carrying refined silver. He looked at her. She said not ore. Refined bars, silver that has already been processed and is being shipped to banks. He said yes. 25. The drivers had said so in their statements, and she could read the statements if she wanted. They were in Connell's office, and she was right that the pattern was consistent. He did not ask how she knew to ask the question. He seemed to understand, in the way that honest people understand things about each other, that she had arrived at it the same way he had, by paying attention to what did not fit. She told him about the ledger sheets then. Not everything. Enough. She told him about Harriet's husband, about the $40,000 calculated across 3 years of careful theft, about a man who had gone to work on a Monday morning in 1873 and had not come home. She watched his face as she said it, and she watched the way his jaw set and the way something behind his eyes shifted from suspicion to certainty. He sat down on the stool beside the mending table. He was quiet for long enough that the fire in the stove had shifted and settled before he spoke. He said the old mining camp, Canyon Ridge. She said yes. He said, I know those buildings. I rode through there 2 years ago, checking my fence line in the upper pasture. The main storage structure was intact. The others were falling in, but the main one had a good roof still. She said we need to see what is in it. He did not say yes immediately. He looked at her across the mending table in the lamplight. This man who had sent her away from his life on the day she arrived and had been coming back in small, careful increments ever since, and she could see him working through it. Not whether it was right. He had already decided that. He was working through how. He said we go at night. Full moon in 3 days. Enough light to ride by, but enough dark to have cover. We go in from the ridge, not the valley road. Come down from above where we can see the whole camp before we commit to anything. She said, I am coming with you. He said, I know. He said it in a way that told her he had already accepted this before he finished the sentence, which told her something about him that she filed away carefully. They did not tell Harriet the full plan. They told her enough. Harriet listened with the stillness of a woman who has survived by knowing when to speak and when to let others speak and when to say nothing at all. When they finished, she went to the back room and came out with a heavy coat that had been her husband's. She handed it to Nora without ceremony. She said it is too big, but it is warm. The black dress is not built for a mountain in October. Nora took the coat. 3 days. She had 3 days to wait. She worked through them. The waiting was the hardest thing she had done in recent memory, and recent memory included a great deal that was hard, so that was not nothing. She worked through the mending pile and started on a new one. She delivered finished laundry and collected payment and exchanged the minimum of conversation that courtesy required. She lay on the narrow cot at night and listened to the town and did not sleep much. On the second night, she woke suddenly from no dream she could remember. She was sitting up before she was fully conscious, her heart going fast, the old familiar animal alarm of a body that has learned to wake before the danger arrives. She sat in the dark and breathed. She was in Red Rock, Colorado. She was in the back room of Harriet Vane's laundry. The door was bolted. The window was too small for a grown man. She was safe. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the rough wool blanket and held them there until they stopped. She thought about Silas Voss, which she had been trying not to do for 6 weeks and had managed with varying degrees of success. He had been dead for 6 weeks now, though the arithmetic of it still surprised her when she stopped to count. 6 weeks since a Wednesday night in St. Louis and a staircase and a silence that had felt in the moment like the first silence she had heard in 4 years. The boarding house landlord had arranged the burial quickly and without ceremony, which had suited everyone involved. She had left 8 days later with 11 cents and a letter and a black dress, and she had not looked back because there was nothing behind her worth the turning. She thought not about the staircase itself or the sound of it, which she was not ready to think about directly, but about the morning after, about sitting on the floor of an empty room watching a Missouri dawn come gray and thin through a window, and about the letter she had answered that same evening by candlelight. About the specific quality of hope that lives inside desperation when desperation has finally run out of alternatives. She pressed her hands flat on the blanket until they stopped shaking. She lay back down and watched the ceiling until the thin gray light of pre-dawn began to come through the gap near the roof. On the third night, she met Eli at the edge of town, where the road north turned to trace the base of the first ridge. He was already there when she arrived, 2 horses saddled and standing patient in the dark, his bay gelding and a smaller mare that was the color of old pewter in the moonlight. He looked at her when she came up out of the shadows. He looked at Harriet's coat, which was indeed too large but was doing its job. He looked at the black dress visible below the coat hem and said nothing about it. He handed her the reins of the gray mare. He said, her name is Cora. She is the most sure-footed animal I have ever owned on loose rock. Trust her feet more than your own instincts, and she will take care of you. Nora put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. It had been 9 years since she had ridden regularly. The saddle felt both foreign and familiar, the particular sensation of a body remembering something the mind had half forgotten. They rode north without speaking. The moon was 3 days past full and still threw enough light to make the snow on the upper slopes glow blue-white, and the road ahead of them was visible as a pale stripe threading between dark timber. The horses moved steadily, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The temperature was perhaps 20 degrees and dropping as they climbed. After perhaps 40 minutes, when the lights of Red Rock were no longer visible behind them and the timber had thickened on both sides, Eli spoke. He said he wanted to tell her something before they got where they were going. He said it in the way a man says something when he has decided to say it regardless of the outcome, having run out of reasons not to. He said my wife's name was Sarah. She died in the winter of 1875. She was 34 years old. We had been married 11 years. She died in our bed in the ranch house, 3 miles north of where you are sleeping right now, and she took the child with her, a daughter. We had decided on a name. He did not say what the name was. He said I was in the room, I held her hand. I talked to her and I prayed, which I had not done since I was a boy, and I sat there and watched the light go out of her face and there was nothing. Nothing I could do, nothing I could have done differently. The doctor in Durango told me later that it was a condition of the blood that no medicine available could have changed the outcome. I have spent 3 years not believing him. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through a stretch of shadow where the timber came close on both sides, and then emerged into open moonlit ground again. He said, I am telling you this because I owe you the truth. You came here because of Allah, and you have stayed because of your own courage and your own need, and I have been in and out of your life since you arrived without ever explaining myself properly. A man who cannot explain himself is just making noise. The trail began to climb more steeply, and they slowed to let the horses find their footing. Nora said she sounds like someone worth grieving. He said she was. She is. There is no past tense for it. She said, I know. She said nothing else for a moment. The horses picked their way up a section of trail where loose shale showed through the snow, and both animals went carefully testing each step. Cora moved with exactly the delicacy Eli had described, placing her feet as if she understood the consequences of carelessness. The mare's left rear hoof skated slightly on a flat piece of shale, and Nora lurched and grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, which was not dignified but was effective. Eli glanced back. He said, your father taught you to ride. Nora said he said to hold on tight, and that would be enough. She paused. She said he was right, as it turns out. Eli looked at her for a moment longer than necessary and then turned back to the trail ahead. She thought she saw in the moonlight and in profile something that was almost a smile. It was there and gone so quickly she could not be certain. They reached the ridge above Canyon Ridge Camp at midnight. They left the horses in a stand of spruce that offered shelter and concealment and cover for sound tied loosely to lower branches with quick-release knots. Eli had brought a canvas feed bag for each horse that would keep them occupied and quiet. He had thought of things she had not thought of, which she noted and did not say. They covered the last 100 yards on foot, belly down, for the last 20 crawling through snow that was cold enough to burn where it found gaps in their clothing. The ridge edge was a shelf of flat rock that provided cover to the chin and a clear view of the valley below. The camp spread out in the moonlight like something from an older time. Most of the buildings had surrendered to weather and gravity, their walls canted at angles that no functional structure could maintain, their roofs either gone entirely or partially collapsed. But 3 buildings near the center of the camp still stood. Their roofs were intact. From 2 of the chimneys, thin smoke rose and was taken immediately by the wind and dispersed. Firelight showed in one of the windows, and in front of the largest building sat 5 Wells Fargo strongboxes. Even from this distance, and in this light, she could see that their locks had been broken. Their lids were open. Beside them, stacked inside 3 wooden crates, something caught the moonlight and held it. The particular dull gleam of metal that has been refined until it has no interest in anything but its own weight. Nora looked at the silver bars and thought about $40,000 and a man named Cyrus Vane who had died so that someone could keep stealing. Eli put his mouth close to her ear and spoke in a voice that was barely a breath. He said there were at least 2 men outside, one near the main building and one doing a slow circuit of the perimeter. He said he needed to get within 50 yards of those crates to read the serial numbers stamped into the metal. The numbers would match the official robbery reports. Without them, what they had was a disused mining camp and some silver that Chester Holt could claim was legitimately stored. He said she should stay on the ridge. He said it without looking at her, already reading the terrain below, already planning the route. She said, and if something goes wrong, he said, you ride. You ride hard and you go straight to Harriet and you tell her everything and you put those ledger sheets in the hands of the minister because the minister is the one person in this town that Holt has never fully owned. You do not try to help me. You do not come back down. She said, understood. He gave her a long look that suggested he understood. The word understood could cover a great deal of territory. Then he went over the edge of the ridge. She watched him move down the slope through the scrub pine and loose rock, and what she watched was a man who had been through a war or something like one, in the way he used shadow and slow movement, and the particular patience of someone who knows that speed is almost never the answer. He was 50 yards from the ridge in 3 minutes, 100 yards in 10. The guard near the main building was facing the other direction. The second guard had completed his circuit and gone inside. Eli covered the last 30 yards in a low run that she almost did not see because he timed it to a period when the cloud cover thickened over the moon and the camp dropped briefly into deeper shadow. He reached the crates. She breathed through her nose and watched the building door and the space around the corner of the nearest standing wall and the approach from the left where the second guard had gone. She was aware of her own heartbeat in the way you become aware of your heartbeat when you cannot afford for it to interfere with anything. He was crouched behind the second crate, his notebook out, working by the light of a small stub of candle that he had lit inside his cupped hands. She could barely see the flame. It was enough. The door of the main building opened. Not the front door, a side door half hidden by the angle of the building that neither of them had seen from above because it faced a direction they had not been watching. Two men came out. One of them she did not recognize. The other one she recognized by the way he walked, the particular deliberate heel strike before she could see his face. Wade Colton. And behind him, dressed absurdly in an expensive coat that was entirely wrong for an abandoned mining camp in the mountains in October, Chester Holt. They were walking directly toward the crates. Nora did the calculation in the time it takes to breathe once. Eli was behind the second crate. Holt and Colton were approaching from an angle that would bring them alongside the first crate and then past it to the second. They would see him. There was no position he could retreat to in time. The slope back to the ridge was open ground. A man running across open ground in moonlight is a very simple problem for a man with a gun. She looked at Eli's rifle. He had left it with her. She had not asked why. She had assumed it was because rifles are long and awkward when you are crawling through snow on your belly. Now she understood it was because he had known exactly what he was asking her not to do. She picked it up. It was heavier than she had expected. Her father had taught her basic marksmanship when she was 12 years old behind the tailoring shop in Harrisburg, paper targets, nailed defense posts. She had not fired a gun in 16 years. She was not going to shoot anyone. She pointed the barrel at the sky above the camp at a point roughly 45 degrees above the ridgeline, to her left, away from any man or horse or structure. She steadied her breathing the way her father had taught her. She held the stock correctly against her shoulder because she could still hear his voice explaining the consequence of holding it wrong. She fired. The sound was enormous. It hit the canyon walls and came back doubled, and then trebled, a rolling concussion that bounced between the ridges and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Every man in the camp below stopped moving. Every head turned in every direction. The two men emerging from the building reached for weapons and then hesitated because the echo made it impossible to locate the source. In the 4 seconds of that confusion, Eli Whitmore closed his notebook, rose from behind the crate, and ran. He made the base of the ridge slope in the time it took Holt's men to decide what they were shooting at. He made the first stand of scrub pine 2 seconds later. By the time Colton had posted men at the camp perimeter and organized a search of the surrounding ridgeline, Eli was back over the top and moving through the dark timber toward the horses. And Nora was already there, already mounted Cora's reins in one hand and the bay geldings in the other. He came through the trees at a controlled run and took the reins she held out and swung up in one motion, and before she had processed that, he was there and safe and mounted. They were moving. Not down the way they had come, north and west into higher ground away from the obvious road. He rode with the focus of a man who was doing several things at once and not wasting capacity on anything else. She matched his pace and his direction and did not speak. They rode for 40 minutes through terrain that was increasingly steep and increasingly remote, pushing hard up grades that the horses took with their heads low and their muscles working, and then following a ridgeline west until the sound of anything human had been gone for long enough that the night had settled back into its own sounds. Wind, the occasional crack of a branch under snow load. Once the close passage of an owl cutting low through the trees that made Cora flinch and recover in a single movement. Eli finally slowed and then stopped in a hollow behind a rock formation large enough to block the wind on 2 sides. He swung down and Nora swung down after him, and they stood with the horses between them and their breath making clouds in the cold air, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, and his voice was not raised, but it had an edge in it that she recognized as a particular edge of a man suppressing a stronger reaction. I told you to stay on the ridge. She said, and you are standing here alive. Are you saying hello or are you complaining? He looked at her. The moonlight was enough to see by, if not well, and what she saw in his expression was a collision of things. Anger and relief, and something that she did not quite have a name for, something that had to do with being seen unexpectedly in a moment when you thought you were invisible. He said both. She handed him the rifle. Their hands touched briefly in the exchange, her cold fingers in his, and neither of them made any adjustment for that. He put the rifle back in the scabbard. He reached into his coat and withdrew the notebook and opened it toward the moonlight and looked at the page he had written on. She could see the numbers from where she stood, a long series of them, stamped metal identifiers, the kind of numbers that could be matched against official records. He said these are the boxes from 4 of the 5 robberies. Not all 5, but 4. He was quiet for a moment. That was not about the numbers. She waited. He said there is something else. He said it with the same precision he had given everything else, which made it worse. Near the back of the main building. A trench, covered with old boards. 4 men. He stopped. She said Cyrus Vane and 3 others. He said that is what it appears to be. He closed the notebook. He did not say anything else for a while. There are some things that require a moment of silence that is not ceremonial, but simply human, the smallest acknowledgement that something happened that should not have happened and cannot be made to not have happened by any effort or will. He said, this is enough. This is more than enough. She said it is enough if we get it to the right people before Holt finds out what we saw. He came tonight. Holt himself was there. Men like Holt do not stand in abandoned mining camps in the mountains in October unless they are moving something. He was there to move all of it, the silver and the evidence both. She understood what that meant. Whatever had been at Canyon Ridge would be gone by morning, redistributed, dispersed into channels that would be impossible to trace. The strong boxes might be destroyed or moved farther into the mountains. The silver bars would be broken down or shipped out through routes that left no record. And the trench would be emptied and refilled and covered and left for the spring thaw to work on, and by April there would be nothing remaining that a court could use. They had one night. They rode the long way back to Red Rock, staying high and using a route that Eli knew, and she did not, threading through high passes that should have been closed in October, but were not quite, not yet. The temperature dropped steadily, and her face went from cold to numb to a kind of absence of sensation that she understood was not good. She tucked her chin into the collar of Harriet's coat and breathed through her nose and concentrated on Cora's movement beneath her. They talked in the stretches where the ground was level enough to allow it. He asked her about Missouri, not about her marriage, just about the place, what it looked like, what she had done there. She told him about her father's tailoring shop, about the long windows that faced east, and the way the morning light came through them at an angle that was perfect for fine work. About the smell of the place, which was wool and sizing, and the particular clean smell of good thread, and which she associated with her father's hands and her father's voice, teaching her things that had turned out to matter more than she had known at the time. She asked him about the ranch. He described it briefly in the spare way a man describes a thing he knows too well to see clearly anymore. The barn that needed a new roof before spring. The fence line along the upper pasture that wanted 2 new posts. The particular quality of the light on the mountains in early morning, which he had watched through the same window for 12 years, and which was the one thing about the place he had never taken for granted and did not expect to. She thought about 12 years of looking at the same mountains through the same window. She thought about what it meant to have a place that specific, that known, that held together in your mind by 12 years of accumulated mornings. She had never had a place like that. She had lived in 6 different rooms since she was 20 years old and had not been sorry to leave any of them. The lights of Red Rock appeared below them close to 2 in the morning, the mountains having given them a faster route down than the one they had taken up, a scatter of yellow windows in the dark, the town looking small and provisional from this height, as if it had not quite committed to being there permanently, which she supposed it hadn't. They came down the north road and passed the church and the end of the main street, and she was already thinking about what came next, about Harriet and the ledger sheets and the minister and the logistics of getting a set of ledger sheets and a notebook full of serial numbers to a federal marshal before Chester Holt had time to cover what she and Eli had seen. The laundry was at the far end of the street. She saw the man standing in front of it before she understood what she was seeing. He was standing very still in the dark between the laundry porch and the building next to it, in the particular way that people stand when they have been waiting a longer time and have decided to conserve themselves for whatever comes next. He was perhaps 5'10" lean, with the kind of leanness that is not health but deprivation. He was wearing a coat she recognized, a brown wool coat with a tear in the left elbow that she had mended herself 3 years ago. He had a different face than she remembered, or rather he had the same face arranged differently, the way a familiar landscape looks different after a long drought. The softness was gone from it. What remained was just the structure underneath which had always been harder than it looked. Silas Voss was not dead. He turned when he heard the horses and found her face immediately the way a man finds something he has been looking for across a long distance, with the particular sharpened attention of someone whose focus has been narrowed to a single point for a very long time. He did not say her name. He did not need to. The way he looked at her said everything he had rehearsed across 3 weeks of tracking her from St. Louis to Durango to Red Rock, through mud and rail and mountain road to this dark street before the town had finished its sleeping. He took a step toward her. Eli Whitmore moved his horse between them. He did it without asking and without explanation, and the bay gelding was large enough that it stopped Silas Voss's progress as effectively as a wall. Eli looked down at him from the saddle with the gray winter sky eyes and said nothing at all, which was louder than anything he could have said. Silas looked up at him. Then he looked past him at Nora. He said, "I have been a long way to find you." She said, "I know." He said, "You need to come home." She said, "That is not my home anymore." Inside the laundry, a lamp came on. Harriet's silhouette appeared in the window, looked out, and disappeared. 30 seconds later, the sound of the back door came, and then footsteps on the frozen ground, and then Harriet was on the porch with a shotgun held across her body at the angle of a woman who has used one before and is prepared to use one again. She looked at Silas Voss with the expression of a woman who has seen every variety of man that exists and has organized them into categories long before they arrive. She said, "This is private property. The laundry opens at 7. Come back then." He looked at her. He looked at Eli's horse still between him and Nora. He looked back at Harriet and the shotgun. He said, "I am her husband." Harriet said, "Then you can wait until 7 like everyone else." He stood in the dark for another moment, and the moment stretched. Then he turned and walked back toward the main street, his footsteps deliberate on the frozen ground, the brown coat disappearing into the dark between buildings. She had not pushed him down those stairs. She needed to be clear about this, even in the privacy of her own mind, because some truths matter regardless of who was listening. She had not pushed him. She had also not caught him. And now here he was in Red Rock, Colorado, alive and walking and working for Wade Colton. She understood that last part without anyone needing to tell her. It was in the way he had arrived at this particular building, at this particular hour, as if he had been told where to wait and had waited. It was in the brown coat with the mended elbow worn past the point of warmth, the coat of a man who had not found new employment on his own. Somewhere across town in the house with the good carpets and the Denver-made furniture, a lamp was still burning in Chester Holt's study. She did not know this. She had no way of knowing it. But she would have believed it if someone had told her. And in that room, if she had been able to see it, she would have seen Holt standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the dark street, while Wade Colton stood at his shoulder and said 2 sentences that brought a stillness to the older man's face that was more frightening than any expression of anger could have been. They had the numbers. Whoever it was, they had time to copy the serial marks before we came out. Holt stood at the window for a long time. He was a patient man. He had built his fortune through patience, through the understanding that time worked for people who knew how to use it and against people who did not. He had made decisions in his life that required a particular kind of coldness, the coldness of a man who has decided that some outcomes justify any method of arriving at them, and he had made those decisions without flinching and without losing sleep and without anything that resembled doubt. He turned from the window. He said, "The laundry. Tonight. Make sure the woman gets out first." Colton said, "Which woman?" Holt said, "Harriet Vane. She has been a problem for 5 years. I want the problem finished, not compounded." He walked away from the window. He said the papers she has been keeping. Make sure you find them first. Colton went out. Holt stood in the middle of his study in his expensive coat and looked at the fire in the grate and felt for the first time in a very long time the particular sensation of a man who has been running calculation that was always going to come due and who has finally heard the sound of it arriving. He was not frightened. He did not do frightened. He began very calmly to plan. The laundry burned at 2:30 in the morning. Nora smelled it first. She had been lying on the narrow cot in the back room, not sleeping, running through the problem of Silas Voss with the same thoroughness she brought to a difficult mending job, turning it over and looking at the seams from every angle when the smell came under the door. Not wood smoke, something sharper. Kerosene and scorching timber and the particular sweetness of fabric catching fast. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. She took her carpet bag from the floor beside the cot, which she had never unpacked entirely, a habit of a woman who had learned not to trust the permanence of any room. She took her father's sewing kit in the daguerreotype, and she did not take the black dress because she was wearing it the same way she had been wearing it every day for 3 weeks, because it was the best garment she owned, and also because she had stopped apologizing for it. She went through the back door into the cold night air, and the cold night air hit her, and the smoke followed her out, and she turned and saw the front of the laundry, orange with firelight, and understood that she had perhaps 40 seconds before the back room followed. Harriet was already outside. She was standing 10 feet from the building, with her arms held slightly away from her sides and her hands turned palms up, and Nora crossed to her and saw in the firelight that both of her hands were burned raw, the skin gone from the palms and the first 2 fingers of each hand. She had gone back in for something. She had gone back in and gotten out, but not without cost. Nora put her arm around Harriet's shoulders and walked her away from the building. The fire was loud now, consuming the dry timber with the enthusiasm of something that has been given it exactly what it needed. And windows were going orange on the street, and doors were opening, and people were emerging in various states of undress to witness the particular civic horror of a building going to ash. Men came with buckets. More men came. The bucket line formed with the automatic coordination of a town that had practiced this particular emergency before. But it was already clear that the buckets were ceremony. The building was gone. Nora stood with her arm around Harriet and watched it go. She said, "What did you go back for?" Harriet said nothing for a moment. Her jaw was set in the way it set when she was managing pain by refusing to give it more space than it had already taken. She said, "The papers. They found the stone. They took them." Nora was quiet. Harriet said, "I should have moved them. I knew this would come. I have known it for 5 years, and I kept telling myself I had more time." Nora said, "How many men?" 3. Colton and 2 others she did not recognize. They came in through the front with a lantern and the kerosene already poured. She had been in the back room and had heard them and had taken the papers from under the stone before they reached her. She had run for the back door. One of them had cut her off and taken the papers from her hands, and she had fought him for them longer than was wise. And then the fire was between her and the back door, and she had gone through the window instead, which was where her hands had been burned. She said this without trembling and without anything in her voice that was not factual. Nora thought about the ledger sheets. She thought about Cyrus Vane's careful handwriting, the columns of numbers that had cost him his life, now ash in a burning building on the main street of Red Rock. She thought about Chester Holt standing at his study window, making a decision with the calm of a man for whom decisions of this kind had long since ceased to cost anything. She was very still inside herself. She recognized the stillness. She had felt it before in the boarding house in St. Louis on a Wednesday night at 11:30, standing at the top of a staircase. It was not courage exactly. It was what is left when fear has been used up and something more durable takes its place. She said, "Come with me." They went to Dr. Halloran's house, which was 3 buildings down and across the street, a man of 62 who had the particular gift of the best country doctors, which was the ability to do a great deal with whatever happened to be available. He wrapped Harriet's hands in clean linen, soaked in something that smelled medicinal and sharp, and told her to keep them still and to come back in the morning. Nora sat in the chair beside the examination table while he worked, and she thought about the copies. She said, 3 years ago, when you said you finally got brave enough to think about using the papers, you said you made copies before you showed anyone the originals because you were too careful not to. It is the kind of thing you would have done. The room was very quiet. Dr. Halloran continued his work without looking up, which was the correct response of a man who understands that some conversations do not include him. Harriet looked at her over the doctor's bent head, and something shifted in her expression. Something that was relief and grief in equal measure, the particular combination of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and has just been told that they do not have to carry it alone anymore. She said Reverend Aldous has had a sealed envelope in his vestry desk for 3 years. He does not know what is in it. I told him it was letters of personal importance and asked him to keep them safe until I asked for them back, or until something happened to me, whichever came first. Nora let out a breath. She said, then we still have the numbers. We have Eli's notebook, and we have your copies, and we have enough. Harriet looked at her hands wrapped in white linen. She said Colton took the originals. Holt will think he has finished it. Nora said, good. Let him think that until morning. She found Eli at his ranch an hour later. She rode Cora, who was still saddled from the night, because there had not been time to attend to anything as normal as unsaddling a horse. The ranch was dark when she arrived, but there was light under the door, which meant he was awake. He answered her knock before she had finished knocking. He was still in the blue work shirt. He looked at her face and then looked past her at Cora standing at the hitching rail and then stepped back from the door without asking questions. She told him about the fire, about Harriet's hands, about the papers and the copies at the Reverend's house. He listened with the stillness he brought to everything that mattered. When she finished, he said, Silas Voss. She said he will come back in the morning. He came to bring me back to Missouri or to ensure I could not interfere. Holt will tell Colton what to do about that. Eli said, I will deal with Voss. She looked at him. He said, not the way you are thinking. I will put him in front of Drum Connell in the morning. Whatever Connell is or is not, he will not allow a man to carry a woman across a state border against her will. There are laws he cannot ignore, even if he wants to. She said, I thought Connell was Holt's man. Eli was quiet for a moment. He said, I have been thinking about Drum Connell for 3 days. I have been thinking about the specific way he has been useless for the past 2 years. Too consistent, too predictable in his failures. A man who is genuinely corrupt, makes mistakes, has moments of overreach, gets careless. Drum Connell's particular brand of looking the other way has been almost architecturally precise. The same amount of wrong in every situation. Never more, never less. She thought about this. He said a man playing a long game looks exactly like a man playing no game at all if he is good at it. She said, you think he has been collecting his own evidence? Eli said, I think it is possible. I think it is worth finding out. He was already reaching for his coat. They went to Connell's house, which was a modest frame building behind the church with a lamp burning in the front window at 3 in the morning, which told them something before they knocked. Drum Connell answered the door with a rifle and then lowered it when he saw who was standing on his porch. He looked at them both for a moment and then looked at the dark street behind them and stood back to let them in. His son Pip was sitting at the kitchen table in his nightclothes drinking cold coffee out of a mug that was too large for his hands, with the wide-awake expression of a child who has been waiting for something he knew was coming. He was 10 years old and small for his age, and had his father's eyes and his mother's directness, which was a useful combination in a world that often required both at the same time. Connell set the rifle against the wall. He sat down at the table across from his son. He looked at Nora and then at Eli and then at his own hands on the table. He said, I heard the fire. Eli said, we know about Canyon Ridge. Connell was quiet. Nora said, we were there tonight, before the fire. We have the serial numbers from 4 of the 5 strong boxes, and Harriet Vane has copies of her husband's ledger sheets with Reverend Aldous. And we have enough to bring a case that cannot be dismissed if we get it to someone who cannot be bought. The question is whether you are someone who can help us do that or whether you are going to be in our way. She paused. She said, and there are 4 men buried in a trench behind the main storage building at the Canyon Ridge. We need to add that to everything else. Something moved through Drum Connell's face at that. Something that had been wait for a long time and had just been named. He said, I suspected. I could not prove it. The families were told it was the tunnel. I could not tell them otherwise without evidence and without putting them in danger. He looked at Nora. He said, I have been building this for 2 years. He stood and went to the kitchen dresser and opened the lower drawer and lifted out a cloth-wrapped bundle and set it on the table. He unwrapped it with the care of a man handling something that has cost him considerably to accumulate. Bank statements with specific accounts marked in red ink. A log of dates and amounts spanning from November 1876 to the present week. 3 sworn statements from miners who had witnessed discrepancies in the ore weights and had been afraid to say so to anyone, but had said it to him when he found the right words to ask. A transcript of a conversation he had recorded from memory verbatim on the night he sat outside Holt's office window for 2 hours and heard things that he had written down the moment he reached home in the particular handwriting of a man trying to get every word right while his hands were still shaking. He said, "I have been waiting for the federal marshal circuit. It comes once in spring and once in autumn. The autumn circuit was supposed to reach Red Rock in 2 weeks. I did not have enough yet to guarantee an indictment. I needed the strong box numbers. I needed something physical that could be matched against official records." He looked at Eli. He said, "Now I have them." Eli set the notebook on the table. Pip Connell put down his oversized coffee mug. He said with the precision of a child reporting a completed task, "I sent the telegram just over an hour ago." Everyone looked at him. He said, "When I saw the fire, I knew what it meant. Papa told me what to do if something like this happened before he could do it himself. The telegraph office man, Mr. Briggs, his daughter is sick, and he stays there nights so he can keep the stove going for her. I knocked and he opened up and I sent it. The federal marshal's office in Denver. I told them what Papa told me to say, and I told them we needed them to come now and not in 2 weeks." He looked at his father. He said, "I memorized the address and the exact words you told me. I did not change anything." Drumconnell looked at his son for a long moment with an expression that had nothing in it except the particular quality of a man who is very glad of the specific person sitting across from him. There are moments in a life when you look at someone you love and understand with a completeness that does not require words that they are going to be all right. This was one of those moments. Connell sat with it for the 3 seconds it deserved and then came back to the work at hand. He said, "Good boy." Pip said, "When will they get here?" Connell said, "Hard riding, best case tomorrow night, more likely the following morning." Nora said, "Holt is moving the silver tonight. He was at Canyon Ridge. He will have cleared everything by dawn. The trench too. He will empty it." Connell said, "Let him move it. Moving stolen goods is a different and better crime than storing them, and a harder one to argue away in court. And I know every road out of this valley. I know where he has to go, and I know where we can be waiting." He looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. Then he looked at Nora. He said, "The men in that trench." He looked at Eli. Eli described it. He described it in the exact manner of a man who had stood in that place and understood that precision was the only thing that would bring those 4 men home properly. The distance from the main structure, the angle from the storage door, the warped boards, the disturbed earth at the margins. He described it until Connell was satisfied and had written down everything he said. He said, "I need to wake some men." The men he woke were not the ones Nora expected. They were not the deputies who had ridden with him on the posse, most of whom had been chosen for their usefulness to Chester Holt. They were miners who had worked the Holt mine for years at wages that had never quite risen to match the profits they pulled from the ground. They were men who ran small businesses that had been slowly, methodically squeezed by Holt's control of the town's commerce. They were 3 men who had lost a friend in the mine accident of 1873 and had never accepted the official explanation, who had sat with that unacceptance for 5 years, because unacceptance without evidence is just grief with nowhere to go. By 4 in the morning, standing in the dark behind the church in the first light snowfall of what would become a heavy night, there were 29 men. Nora counted them. Some were old, several were very young. Most of them were somewhere in between the age of men who have been somewhere long enough to have an opinion about it and to have decided that the opinion matters enough to act on. They had rifles and shotguns, and in 2 cases, revolvers of questionable reliability, and in the case of one elderly man named Pratt, who ran the hardware store, a shotgun that he held with the quiet competence of a man who had been using one longer than some of the people present had been alive. He had said almost nothing since Connell woke him and explained the situation. He had put his boots on and picked up his shotgun and come out into the dark, and that was everything that needed to be said. Harriet Vane was there. Her hands were wrapped in white linen, and she was standing at the edge of the group with her arms folded across her chest in the manner of a woman attending something she has waited a long time to attend. Nobody had told her to come. Nobody had needed to. Eli stood beside Connell at the front. The blue work shirt was visible under his open coat, the collar turned up against the cold. He was looking at the road that led north and then cut west toward the pass, the road that any convoy leaving Red Rock with a significant load of silver would have to use if it intended to reach the rail connection at Durango. He had chosen the ambush site 2 hours earlier, walking it in the dark with Connell reading the terrain the way he read fence lines and weather for what it could offer and what it could deny. A bend in the road where the canyon narrowed, where wagons would have to slow, where the high ground on both sides provided cover, and fields of fire, and most importantly, no way around and no way back, that did not require turning a heavy wagon on a mountain road in the dark. Nora stood near the back of the group. She had the same rifle she had fired on the ridge at Canyon Ridge, which Eli had given her without ceremony and without making anything of it beyond what it was. She held it the way her father had taught her, broken open, unloaded, carried safely until it was needed. She thought, standing in the cold dark, waiting for dawn, about the night Silas Voss fell down the boarding house stairs in St. Louis. She had been coming back from the building's shared kitchen with water for the morning, which she always fetched the night before because fetching it in the morning meant crossing paths with the landlord who had opinions about women whose husbands drank. She had been on the second-floor landing when she heard him on the stairs above her, his footsteps carrying the particular heaviness that meant a certain amount of whiskey had preceded him, and she had done what she always did, which was make herself small against the wall and wait for him to pass. He had not passed. His heel had caught the edge of the top step, and he had gone forward and down, and the sound of it was something she would carry in her body for the rest of her life, the series of impacts and the silence after them. She had stood on the landing with the water jug in her hands. She had not pushed him. She needed to be clear about this, even in the privacy of her own mind, because some truths mattered regardless of who was listening. She had not pushed him. In 4 years of marriage, she had absorbed things she did not intend to absorb and had become smaller in ways she intended now to reverse, but she had not pushed him. She had also not caught him. She had stood there for what felt like a very long time, long enough for the understanding to settle through her that he was not getting up long enough for her to identify what was moving through her chest and to be surprised by it, because what was moving through her chest was not grief and not horror, but a door opening at the end of a dark hallway onto a morning she had stopped believing existed. She had gone down the stairs. She had checked his pulse. There was none. She had gone back upstairs and sat on the floor of their room with her back against the wall and watched the window go from black to gray to the pale, thin light of a Missouri dawn. She had sat there until the light was full enough to see by, and then she had answered a letter from a man in Colorado she had never met, who had described himself as rough but fair, and had offered her a kind of life she had almost forgotten was possible. She had been willing to travel any distance to find out if it was real. She was still standing at the back of the group when Drum Connell's hand went up, and every man in the group went still and silent simultaneously, the particular silence of people attending to the same sound. Wagons, coming from the north, which meant Canyon Ridge. Coming with the particular weight of wagons that are carrying something dense, something that shifts the center of gravity and makes the axles work harder, something that is worth moving before dawn because it is the kind of thing that looks different in daylight. The group moved to their positions with less noise than she had expected from 29 people in the dark. They had been told where to go, and they went there. The road below bent to the right, and the high ground above it was rocky and broken good cover, and within 2 minutes there was nothing visible on the road or either side of it that would tell you that close to 30 people were watching it. Nora found a position behind a flat-top rock that gave her a clear view of the road below and good cover on 3 sides. She loaded the rifle. She breathed. The wagons came around the bend in the pre-dawn dark, 6 of them heavily laden, moving slowly, the horses leaning into the grade. Riders flanked them on both sides, 8 or 10 of them, men who were keeping their hands near their weapons without quite holding them, the posture of men who are alert without quite being alarmed, who believe the difficult part of their evening is behind them. Chester Holt rode near the center of the convoy on a black horse that was the best animal in sight. He was wearing the expensive coat, and he sat his horse with the bearing of a man who has decided that the world will organize itself around his expectations, because it always has, and there is no compelling reason to believe that will change tonight. Drum Connell stepped out onto the road. He did it alone, which was the right call because a line of men with rifles creates a situation, and a single man with a badge standing in a road is a question that requires an answer before it can become anything else. He had the badge in plain view, catching the first gray light of approaching dawn. He held his rifle down at his side unthreatening, deliberate the posture of a man who is confident enough in what he has prepared that he does not need to perform any of it. He said, "Chester." Far enough. Holt reined in his horse. He looked at Connell with the expression of a man encountering an inconvenience he had not budgeted for, but is not yet concerned about. He said, "Drum, step aside. This is legitimate salvage from a storm-damaged storage facility. I have documentation." Connell said, "Documentation of stolen silver does not make it not stolen. Come down off that horse." Holt said, "You are making a serious mistake. You have been a valuable man to me for 2 years, and I would hate to see that end badly for either of us." Connell said, "It ended badly the night Cyrus Vane died under your mountain." "I have just been finishing my paperwork." Something shifted in Holt's expression. Then something very small and very significant, the particular shift of a man who has been told something he did not expect to be told, and who is rapidly revising his understanding of how much the person in front of him knows. He said, "I have 12 armed men." Connell said, "I have more." The high ground on both sides of the road came briefly demonstrably alive with the sound of weapons being made ready, a collective mechanical sound that the narrow canyon focused and amplified into something considerable. The sound of 29 people with guns simultaneously communicating the same information in the same language. Holt looked at the ridges. He was still calculating. She could see it in the way he sat his horse, in the minute adjustments of his shoulders and his hands, a man running numbers in his head while the world waited for the outcome. He was trying to find the variable that made the equation work in his favor. There was no such variable tonight. Then he looked past Connell and found Nora. She was standing in the road. She had come down from the high ground without planning it, without deciding, to the same way she had picked up the rifle on the ridge at Canyon Ridge. She was standing 20 feet behind Connell, in her black dress and Harriet's oversized coat with the rifle at her side, and she was looking at Chester Holt, the way she had learned to look at men like him across 4 years of marriage and 3 weeks in Red Rock, without anger and without fear, with the steady regard of a woman who has nothing left to lose and has discovered, to her own surprise, that this is not poverty, but a form of freedom that most people never find. Holt looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his eyes, a reassessment, a recalculation, a man putting together a sequence of events and arriving at a conclusion about what kind of person had been standing in his town in a black dress for the past 3 weeks. He said, You are a mail-order bride who arrived in my town with 11 cents. She said, "I am." He said, "And you think you have undone me." She said, "I think you undid yourself. I just watched." Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, something older than anger and less useful, the expression of a man who has built his entire life on the assumption that other people are predictable and has just encountered evidence to the contrary. He looked at Colton, who was sitting his horse 3 feet away, with the expression of a man reassessing the mathematics of his situation from the ground up, and the look that passed between them was the look of men who have made too many calculations together to pretend they do not understand each other when the numbers come out wrong. Colton looked at the ridgeline. He looked at Drum Connell. He set his rifle across his saddle horn with the barrel pointed at the sky and raised his right hand slowly, the deliberate, unhurried gesture of a man who has decided that this particular calculation has only one remaining answer. The men around him did the same, one by one, the small individual surrenders that make up the end of something large, each man setting down his weapon or raising his hands with the particular quality of a person who has been doing this for someone else's reasons and has just been released from that obligation. Holt sat his horse for another moment. His hands were still on the reins. He was a man who had built a fortune through patience and calculation and the understanding that time worked for those who knew how to use it, and he was doing in this last moment what he had always done. He was looking for the calculation that produced a different answer. He was arriving for the first time in his life at a total that did not favor him. He dismounted. He did it slowly and with a precision that was almost ceremonial, as if he were choosing the manner of it, even if he could no longer choose the fact of it. He handed the reins to the nearest rider and stepped away from the horse and stood in the road with his hands visible at his sides and his expensive coat and his silver beard and his calculating eyes. And for the first time, Nora could see in him what he had always been under everything else, a man who had wanted things and had never once considered the cost of taking them. He said nothing else. Silas Voss was not at the convoy. He had been, as Eli had predicted, found at the boarding house at first light, sitting on a chair in the hallway outside the room Colton had rented for him, waiting with the beaten patience of a man who has been told to wait and has no better idea than to do exactly that. Drumconnell's deputy, a young man named Garrett, who had been kept carefully ignorant of Connell's larger investigation and was therefore uncompromised, had put him in the jail cell without difficulty or drama. He had not asked for Nora. He had not asked for anything except water, which he received, and to know if there was a stage going east, which there was not, because the passes were closing and the last coach had left 4 days ago and would not return until spring. She heard all of this later from Pip Connell, who delivered information with the thoroughness of someone who understands that details matter and that details omitted for the sake of brevity are often exactly the details that turn out to matter most. She did not go to see Silas Voss. She had nothing to say to him that required his face, and he had nothing to say to her that she needed to hear. Whatever conversation there was between them could wait until the passes opened in spring, and by then the state court would have its own things to say to him about the nature of his employment and the intentions behind it. She had more important things to attend to. The federal marshals arrived the following evening, two of them trail-worn and efficient, with the particular economy of movement of men who travel a great deal and have stopped carrying anything that does not serve a clear purpose. They sat at Connell's kitchen table and read through everything he had assembled over 2 years, the carefully dated log, in the sworn statements, in the bank account documentation, in Harriet's copied ledger sheets, retrieved from Reverend Aldous' vestry, in Eli's notebook with the strongbox serial numbers, and they did not say much while they read, which was the right response of people who understand that reading comes before talking, and that the order matters. In the morning, they took Chester Holt and Wade Colton into custody and began the formal process of a case that everyone in the state and eventually in Denver would read about in the newspapers. The case moved with the particular momentum of something that has been prepared for a long time and is finally moving in the direction it was always meant to go. 3 days later, a team of men led by one of the marshals went up to Canyon Ridge with Eli's description written out and transferred it to action. They found the trench exactly where he had described it. They found what it contained. The federal record was amended and extended, and 4 names were added to a document that would eventually reach the state capitol, and then Washington, and then the families of 4 men who had spent 5 years not knowing what had happened to their fathers and husbands and brothers and sons. Arthur Finch, who had been Holt's clerk for 8 years and had spent those years writing down things he had been very carefully not thinking about, asked to see the marshals on the second day after the arrest. He sat with them for 4 hours. What he told them extended the case in directions that reached all the way to the state capitol and implicated parties that the marshals had not yet considered, which was why the newspapers in Denver would eventually devote considerable space to the story and why it would outlast the town that produced it by several decades. Harriet's hands healed, not completely and not quickly, but steadily and without infection, the way things heal when they are properly attended to and given time and not asked to do too much before they are ready. She sat in the chair beside the kitchen table in Dr. Halloran's house in the first days, and she did not complain and she did not cry, and she accepted the help that was offered with the dignity of a woman who has not often had help offered and has learned to receive it without diminishing either the offer or herself. The town rebuilt her laundry. This surprised her, or rather the speed and thoroughness of it surprised her. Men she had seen look through her on the main street for 5 years showed up with timber and tools. Women she had never spoken to appeared with food and practical assistance, and in some cases with their sleeves already rolled up, ready to work without being asked. It was not precisely an apology, or not only that. It was the particular movement of people who have been complicit in something not through active participation, but through the choice to look away, and who have been given by events a way to be something different. People generally take that opportunity when it is offered clearly enough. She stood on the new porch on the day the last nail was driven and looked at the building that was larger than the one that had burned and better insulated and had a proper floor and 2 windows that faced the morning light, real glass windows rather than oiled paper, the kind of windows that hold the morning and give it back all day. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said Cyrus would have laughed at the windows. He always said the light was better in the morning, and I always said there was never time to look at light in the morning because mornings were for working. She paused. He was right about that. He was right about most things. It was inconvenient. Nora was standing beside her with a hammer she had borrowed and had not yet returned, and a streak of sawdust across the front of the black dress that she had not bothered to brush away. She said he was right about other things, too, it sounds like. Harriet said most things, though I did not always tell him so, which I would do differently now if I had the chance. But you cannot always have the chance, and so you make do with what remains available, which is the memory of someone who deserved better, and the knowledge that at least the record will show it now. She looked at the windows. She said he would have liked those windows very much. The dress, she had been wearing it for 22 days by the time she took it off. She changed into the spare dress from her carpet bag, the gray wool one that was uninteresting and entirely adequate. She folded the black dress carefully, the way she folded everything with the attention to seams and corners that her father had insisted upon, and that had become so habitual, she did it without thinking even now, even when she was thinking about other things entirely. She carried it to where Harriet was sitting on the porch of the new laundry, with her linen-wrapped hands in her lap resting the way they needed to rest. She said, I was wondering if you could do anything with this. She held out the folded black dress. Harriet looked at it. She looked at it the way she had looked at the torn miner's shirt on the very first day, turning the problem over in her mind from multiple angles, assessing what it had been and what it might become in the distance between those two things. She said, the wool is good quality, better than it looks given what you paid for it. Nora said, I paid almost nothing for it. Harriet said, I know. That is precisely what I mean. She reached out with her linen-wrapped hands and took the dress with the careful grip of someone who is working around an injury but is not going to let the injury prevent them from doing what they intend to do. She said, I will make something worth looking at. Nora said, I know you will. Harriet looked at her then with the dark, steady eyes that had seen through everything from the first day, the bruise in the carpet bag and the 11 cents and all the rest of it, and had opened the door anyway. She said, where will you go when the pass is open? Nora said, I have not decided. This was true, and it was also the most honest thing she had said in some time, because for the first time in her adult life, the answer to that question was genuinely open. She had 11 cents, which remained unchanged because she had not yet had wages and had not thought to ask for them in the press of recent events, and she had her father's sewing kit and his daguerreotype and the gray dress and the carpet bag and the skills she had been born with and the skills she had earned and the knowledge which was new and still somewhat unfamiliar in the way of a thing not yet fully broken, in that she was capable of considerably more than surviving. She had not decided where to go. She walked north out of town in the late afternoon, past the church and past the end of the main street, along the road that ran between the low hills toward the distant ridge that marked the boundary of Eli Whitmore's ranch. The sky was the color that Colorado sky gets in late October before the heavy snow comes a blue, so deep and cold it looks like the ceiling of something much older than weather, and the mountains against it were sharp-edged and exact in the way they get when the air has been cleaned of everything imprecise. Every rock and tree line was drawn in the kind of detail that usually only exists in memory, where importance clarifies what observation misses. The ranch was 3 miles from town. She had not seen it in daylight, only once in the dark, and she had not seen it clearly then. She saw it clearly now. It was modest and well-maintained in the manner of a place tended by someone who cares about function and has made a private peace with the absence of ornament. The barn was large and the fence lines were straight and true, the posts set at even intervals, and the wire stretched taut in the way that requires patience and care, and the willingness to do a thing right the first time rather than adequately and again later. The corral held 4 horses who were standing in the late light with the comfortable indifference of animals that have nothing to prove. The house was timber, 2 stories, with a window on the east side that faced the mountains and faced the morning and caught the light that came across the peaks in the early hours and held it. She understood, looking at that window, what 12 years of the same morning looked like, what it would take to stay in a place long enough to know its light, what kind of person makes that choice, and what it costs and what it gives back. Eli was at the gate when she arrived. He was not pretending to be there for any reason other than that he was there. He was wearing the blue work shirt and the brown leather vest, and his hands were on the top rail of the gate, in the way of a man who has been standing there long enough that the position has become comfortable and natural, and he is no longer aware that he chose it. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said the gray dress. She said the black one has been reassigned. He said Harriet. She said she says she will make something worth looking at. He nodded. He looked at the mountains for a moment, at the last light going off the high peaks in the particular way it goes in late October, warm on the rock and cold in the shadow. The two things existing in the same moment within yards of each other. Then he looked back at her. He said, there is a thing I want to say to you, and I have been working out how to say it for approximately 3 days, and I have not made much progress, so I am going to say it badly and hope that is acceptable. She said, go ahead. He said, I sent you away when you arrived. I did it because what you represented, which was the possibility of caring about someone again, was something I had decided I was finished with. I had decided that because the last time I cared about someone, the way a man cares about a wife, I watched her die, and I was helpless to stop it, and the distance between that and nothing seemed preferable to the distance between that and trying again. He stopped. He said, you did not let me stay at nothing. You did not try to pull me back either, which would not have worked and which you seem to understand without being told. You just kept being who you are in front of me, and eventually the distance between that and nothing became the wrong distance. I do not know exactly when that happened. Somewhere between the first day and Canyon Ridge. She said that is not as badly said as you suggested it would be. He said I practiced. The sun was going behind the western ridge, and the shadow came across the land in the slow, unhurried way of something that has all the time available and knows it. The temperature dropped a noticeable degree in the space of a minute as the direct light went the particular cold that comes not from wind, but from the absence of warmth. He said the bunkhouse is empty. I have no hands that stay through winter. They go down to lower country. It is a decent room with a good stove, and it is yours for as long as you want it, with no obligation attached to that offer beyond what you choose to attach to it yourself. She said it in the mornings. He said the east window, best light of the day. I have watched it for 12 years, and it has not once failed to be exactly what it was the morning before, which is the only reliable thing I can tell you about this place. She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about 11 cents and a black dress and a letter she had answered by candlelight on the floor of a church in St. Louis, hoping for something she had not known how to name then. She could name it now, standing at the gate of a ranch 3 miles outside of Red Rock, Colorado, in the last light of a late October afternoon. It was not safety, though safety was part of it. It was not rescue, though she had been in need of things. It was the particular thing that happens when you are seen by someone who sees clearly and finds nothing in what they see that makes them want to look elsewhere. She said I would need a proper workspace for the sewing. Natural light and a good table. I do quality work, and quality work requires the right conditions. He said there is a room off the kitchen. East-facing, I use it for nothing at present. There is a table. She said, and I would expect wages for any work I do on the ranch. Fair wages agreed on in advance and paid on time. I have done the other kind, and I am not interested in repeating the experience. He said agreed. Name your rate in the morning when you have thought about it, and I will tell you if it is what I can manage. She said, and I will make my own decisions about what comes after that, in my own time and by my own judgment, not by anyone else's schedule. He said I would not have it any other way. I have watched you make decisions for 3 weeks, and I have not yet seen you make a poor one. She looked at him across the gate. This man in his blue shirt and brown leather vest, who had told her an unwelcome truth on the day she arrived, and had been finding his way back to her in careful increments ever since, who had ridden into a mountain night with her and told her about his wife by moonlight, and looked at her on a snowy ridge with something in his gray eyes that he had only now found the words for. This man who was not what she had expected and was not what she had come here looking for, and she was beginning to understand possibly exactly what she had needed without knowing she needed it. She put her hand on the gate latch. He opened it from his side. She walked through. The snow began that night, the first real snow of winter, coming in off the high peaks with the settled purpose of something that has been planning this for months and is ready to commit to it fully. By morning, it had covered the road and the fence lines and the corral and the mountains above them and every sharp edge in the visible world, and the valley below held Red Rock, Colorado quiet under white sealed in, until spring met the world reduced to what was already here and what could be built from what was already here. Inside the ranch house, the east window held the morning light, the way Eli had said it would, the way it had for 12 years without failing. She sat at the table in the room off the kitchen with her father's sewing kit arranged in front of her, needles on the left thread, organized by weight scissors closed. And she looked at the mountains through the glass and understood that she had not arrived at the end of something. She had arrived at the place where a thing begins. The difference between those 2 points is everything, and most people spend considerable portions of their lives not knowing which one they are standing at. She was clear about it now. The town of Red Rock would remember that winter for a long time. Not because of the snow, which was heavy, but not unusual for October in the San Juan Mountains. Not because of the trial, which came in the spring and lasted 11 days and resulted in sentences that the newspapers in Denver called exemplary and just. They would remember it for a woman who had arrived in a black dress with 11 cents and had stayed because she chose to, and for the understanding, slow and sometimes reluctant, but eventually thorough, that the things worth having in a life are not the things that come easily or arrive without cost, but the things that are built one careful stitch at a time from whatever you have in your hands. Cyrus Vane's name was entered into the official record of the federal court as a man who had been murdered for telling the truth about what he had seen, which was not the same as being alive, but was considerably better than the alternative, which was being forgotten entirely. The 3 men found with him in the trench at Canyon Ridge were also named and recorded, and their families were found and notified by the federal court, and the notifications were delivered in person by a marshal who had been instructed to take as much time as the families needed, which was the right instruction. Harriet said it was enough. She said it the way she said things that cost her briefly, and without elaboration, looking at the official document that named Cyrus Vane as a man of integrity who had been killed for acting on that integrity. She held the document in her linen-wrapped hands and read it through twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest. Then she went back to work, which was what she had always done, which was what she would continue to do, because work was not the opposite of grief, but one of the things you can do while carrying it. The black dress, when Harriet finished with it, was a different thing entirely. She had taken it apart at every seam and recut the pieces and reassembled them with additions of fabric salvaged from other sources, working with her healing hands through the slow weeks of that sealed-in winter. And what emerged was a garment that moved differently and caught the light differently and looked like something made by someone who understood that the best work takes what it has been given and makes it into what it was always capable of becoming, which is often something considerably better than what it started as. Nora wore it for the first time in early December, when enough snow had fallen and enough events had settled that the town was beginning to find its way back to ordinary life, which is where ordinary life insists on going regardless of what has interrupted it. She wore it to the Sunday service at the church, which was too small for 2 saloons, but which was on that particular Sunday full to the walls with people who had decided that gratitude was worth the cold walk. Harriet was sitting 2 pews ahead of her. The dress suited her. It had always suited her. The black had been right from the beginning, which was the sort of thing that only becomes clear in retrospect, but is completely obvious once it does. Eli Whitmore was sitting at the end of the same pew as Nora, which was not by accident and was not discussed. Some arrangements make themselves without requiring words, which is the best kind. He was wearing a clean blue work shirt under his brown leather vest, which was what he wore on Sundays, and what he would, she suspected, continue to wear on Sundays for a considerable period of time, which was fine with her. After the service, walking back through the snow toward the north road, he said the fence line along the upper pasture. The 2 posts that need replacing. I was thinking of starting on that this week before the ground freezes any deeper. She said, I will come with you. He said, it is cold work. Ground is already hard. She said, I know what hard ground is. I have been working in it for 3 weeks. She paused. I will bring the better mallet. He looked at her. She looked at him. The mountains around them were white and exact and enormous and indifferent, the way mountains are, the way the world is. And the 2 of them were very small in the middle of all that size and stillness. He said, all right. They walked north through the snow, past the church, and past the end of the main street, and out along the road that ran between the low hills toward the ridge, 2 people finding their footing together on ground that was new to both of them, which is the only way that particular kind of journey has ever been made.